Good morning. Welcome to this event in the virtual series assessing China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, hosted by the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. This event is the first of 7 in a series of Friday morning talks during spring semester 2021. The Pardee School's mission is to promote and communicate interdisciplinary research on globally important long-term issues that affect the human condition. This BRI series fits squarely within the Pardee School's mission of contributing scholarship on an important long-term issue, in this case, assessing diverse aspects of China's multi-trillion-dollar BRI program. We begin the series with 2 talks focused on overviews of economic and strategic issues. Then we will proceed to 5 regionally focused sessions before the end of this semester. All 7 Pardee School topical and regional centers are involved in sponsoring different events in this series, indicating the importance of interdisciplinary scholarship to the understanding of such a complex development in international relations. I'm Grant Rode of the Center for the Study of Asia, here to introduce this event sponsored by the Global Development Policy Center, the GDP Center. Boston University professor Kevin Gallagher, director of the center, and its research efforts in global development policy, will speak to us today for about 25 minutes on the economic implications of the BRI, its benefits and risks. We are also fortunate that Pardee Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Asian Political Economy, William Grimes, will make discussant remarks for about 10 minutes. After that, we open the session to a question and answer period for the remainder of our 60 minutes. To ask a question, hit the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please type in your name and affiliation, and then your question. We'll get to as many questions as we can. Professor Gallagher, welcome to the series. Thank you for starting the spring semester with your talk on economic risks and benefits of the BRI.
Thanks, Grant, and thanks everyone for coming. It's great that we're doing this series. We had planned on spending a couple days with everybody in person last year, and unfortunately we can't do that. And so I'm glad that you put this online, and welcome everyone for coming. GDP Center is excited to be part of all of this. And I'm honored to kick it off with looking at some of the economic pictures. I named my talk the BRI, or Chinese Overseas Development Finance Benefits and Risks. All this work that I'll be presenting, even though I'm presenting it, it's part of a whole team effort. Here at the GDP Center, we have something called the Global China Initiative, which examines the social, economic, and environmental impacts of Chinese overseas economic activity. We have a number of partnerships with different universities in Beijing, the Andean Amazon in Brazil, in Southern Africa, and in Indonesia. We also host something called the Global China Fellows Program, which is for pre-doctoral and postdoctoral studies from BU students, but also we've had students from across the world and from many different nations. We maintain a number of data sets, and I'll be showing some of that today. The China Latin America Finance Data Set, the China Global Energy Finance Data Set, the China Overseas Development Finance Data Set, the China's Global Policy Data Set, and in a couple months we'll start publishing the China Africa Data Set. We also do a lot of research. We've published about 25 papers on the BRI. I'll be trying to synthesize some of that today on data and trends, what some of the determinants are, and what the outcomes are from an economic, social, and environmental perspective. And for those of you who are at the GDP Center inauguration with Ban Ki-moon, we promise not only to be a think tank, but also to be a do tank. So we engage on the policy implications of our findings in numerous policy venues. And again, this is a team effort. I'll be discussing work that a whole bunch of us have been working on. The 8 on the left are the full-time staff working on this at the GDP Center, but the 10 or whoever, all the folks are on the right are a number of our collaborators that we publish a number of papers with. So this is far from Kevin Gallagher's findings by himself. I'm just going to make 3 points. Number one is that China's overseas development finance, which is manifest in the Belt and Road Initiative, has immense development potential, and some of that development has already started to occur. However, this is a very large and immense project, and with large and immense projects come major risks. I will give a quick overview of what those risks are, but our center is focused on debt sustainability, climate change, biodiversity, and threats to indigenous people. That's what I'll focus on in mine. The BRI is needed now more than ever, given the world crisis that we're in and the goals that we have over the next decades to 2030 and 2050, but it'll only meet its promise if both China and host countries try to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. And I'll try to outline what some of those policies might be. So let's start with the benefits. What are the benefits of the BRI? On many ways, they are working to fill massive infrastructure gaps in the local global economy, meet growth targets in the global economy, and they also give developing countries more agency about choice with respects to different financial options for their development goals. Quickly, the Belt and Road Initiative, since I'm the first speaker in the series, it has 5 stated priorities: policy coordination, infrastructure connectivity, trade integration, and financial integration, and cultural exchange along the Belt Road. It touches about 62% of the world's population, and China's promised about $1 trillion in financing for it, and according to our calculations, they're about halfway there already. The stated strategic priorities from the Chinese government are to support China's go global policy, to help their firms go global and be global players, to increase China's exports to BRI countries, to promote an industrial structuring within China to shift away from low-skilled work and export-led industrialization towards cleaner production, consumption-based, and a different domestic sector. Fifth is to strengthen China's geopolitical ties, to expand the renminbi globally, and to reduce some of the problems that they've had with industrial overcapacity. You could take this slide 20 years ago and just flip out BRI and call it Japan. China hasn't invented this model. It's adapting previous models and putting them on steroids. There's also real benefits for host countries. This is a stepwise increase in the level of development finance, as I'll show you in a second, that's been available to emerging market and developing countries over the past 20 years. And it has, according to the World Bank, the highest potential in terms of its economic gains. It also offers a bit of a different development model. Most of the development finance that's out there in the world is for policy reform, for health and education. China's development finance is for infrastructure and industrialization. So one, it's a different development model, and two, it complements existing kinds of development finance, doesn't necessarily compete with it. It's also South-South cooperation and doesn't have the policy conditionalities that some of its Western counterparts have gained some stigmas for it. And it also gives a little bit more agency to developing economies because they can choose amongst a variety of development finance providers rather than just have one game in town. We did a study in 2019 with the Brookings Institution on global infrastructure gaps and the extent to which they're being met. The gray line here on the right is what current annual spending in the global economy is. For infrastructure, it's about 5.5% of GDP. If we're going to meet the global infrastructure gaps that we have, which are grave, we know, no matter where you are, except perhaps if you're in mainland China, all you have to do is look out the window and see what our infrastructure gaps are. We estimate with the Brookings Institution that you have to mobilize about 2.2% of GDP on an annual basis in between now and 2030 to meet those gaps, and to meet those gaps in a 21st century way that is sustainable in terms of climate resilience and cleaner energy, and resilient and inclusive with respect to bringing more people into the economy. We're doing a terrible job on that. Our study shows that multilateral development banks and private capital flows are only providing about 2% of what's needed. the national development banks moving around the world, like the JICA in Japan, the KfW, and the China Development Bank are the largest, but still far and away. But China is really helping to fill those gaps. In December at the GDP Center, we released something called China's Overseas Development Finance Database, where we put together an estimate of Chinese overseas development finance from the China Development Bank and the Import Bank of China across the world. In between 2008 and 2019, we estimate, and we spatially locate them, that's what all the dots are on these maps. We estimate that it's upwards of $464 billion over that period, 859 projects in 93 countries. To put that into perspective, that's almost exactly what the World Bank has done during the same period. So a stepwise increase in development finance for emerging market and developing countries. On the left here is that map in a couple pie charts, one with respect to where it goes around the world in terms of the dollar amounts, not the project numbers, but in terms of the dollar amounts, Latin America and the Caribbean is the largest. In terms of project numbers, however, Asia and Africa are larger. Mostly going to the Brazils, Colombias of the world. Some of it's going to the Ecuadors and Ghanas of the world. Not too much of it going to the Hades of the world, and some of it's going to Greek ports and to some power plant in Texas, but not too much. And it's filling those infrastructure gaps. If you look at all that finance, 72% of it is going into transportation corridors, pipelines, and electric power around the world. Not too much going into some of the other sectors that traditional development finance goes into. Last year, we had Michela Ruta from the World Bank come and present their study on the economic potential of the BRI. The report's called Belt Road Economics. And the modeling group in the World Bank said, what is the potential for economic growth, trade, and investment from the BRI? They estimate that the BRI, when completed, will increase trade in BRI countries by close to 10% and foreign direct investment by 7.6%. That'll have a global income impact because of all that new interconnectivity in that infrastructure by about 3% of GDP, 2.9. And for Belt Road economies, obviously, since they're going to be so close to it, 3.4%. To put that into perspective, the same group modeled the impacts of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which only has about a 1.1% growth impact. The BRI's potential is about 3 times larger than the TPP. I see that Minya is on the call here. I highly recommend her book on the Belt Road, and she shows that in part, the BRI is a function of China not being included in the TPP. With large, massive, multi-billion-dollar, $500 billion mega infrastructure projects, there's a lot of risks. That kind of work in the countries that we're engaging in is endemic to a variety of risks on the macroeconomic and government side and on the environmental and social side. Currency risk, corruption and delays, stranded assets, projects that don't happen or aren't cost effective by the time they're done, coordination risk, and something that the whole world economy is focusing on right now, debt sustainability. There's also climate risk, depending upon the where and how you build this infrastructure. Is it resilient enough to withstand hurricanes? Is it resilient enough to withstand flooding? And also, will it accentuate climate change? Will it produce more emissions and offer other ecosystem, health, social, and reputational risks for the Chinese state? In 25 minutes, can't go all over those, and our center doesn't work on all of these. I can field questions about some of them because we try to keep up on what everyone's saying. I'm going to focus on the small group in yellow that we focus on here in the world at the GDP Center. This is from an article that we published in the journal Science last Friday, where we use our data set to look at China's overseas debt exposure. There's a lot of conversation, a lot of chatter about the fact that we're in a global debt crisis right now. Many countries in the world are having trouble paying their dollar-denominated international debts as they try to attack the virus and protect the vulnerable. About 30% of the global debt is owed to international Western financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Another 30% of that debt is owed to private bondholders, largely with contracts in New York and London. And then the rest of it are bilateral official debt flows, of which China is the largest. And China is part of a G20 effort where those bilateral debtors, the China Development Bank, United States Agency for International Development, the Development Finance Corporation in the United States, the French Development Bank, JICA and JBIC in Japan, those institutions have agreed under the G20 to alleviate debt in two ways. One, through something called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which suspends payments to those institutions through July of 2021, and something called the Common Framework for Debt Restructuring under the G20. If countries are insolvent, they go to these institutions and they ask for full-on debt relief on the net present value of the debt, like literally cutting how much is actually owed, not cutting how much is paid. China is the largest participant in those programs. Some countries haven't participated at all, where lots of people are very concerned the private sector isn't playing any role at all, and the Western international financial multilateral institutions aren't part of it, but bilaterals are. The French and Germans are very active in it, but China is the largest participant. This year, we've already had 3 countries go to the window for restructuring, the third being this morning. We've had Chad, Ethiopia, and now Zambia, and I'll get to Zambia in a second. There, we identify 11 countries that have significant exposure to China, both in their total loan commitments and the payments that are due over the next couple of years. And they're outlined in maroon here in this, and I'll zero in a little bit closer. On Latin America, despite the rhetoric that it's all about China, it's all about private bondholders. That's what the debt is in Latin America. If you look at the red on the left-hand slide here, that is 60% of the overseas debt that's owed in Latin America is to private bondholders. The official bilateral creditors is 5%, 5% of that. Latin America, it was the region of the world that's worst hit in terms of the health with COVID, with over with 500,000 deaths already, and in economic terms. They had a 7.7% contraction in 2020. That's the rest of the world had as bad as a contraction as the Great Depression. Latin America's contraction was the worst it had in 120 years. Most Latin American countries are spending 30 to 70% of government revenue on servicing these debts. This isn't so much a China problem as much as some in Washington will make it out to be, except for in the 3 countries that I outline here, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Jamaica, where total Chinese borrowing as a percentage of GDP is pretty high relative to their total external debts. This is a picture that our colleagues at SAIS that we work with very closely on comparative analyses on these have done with China and African debt distress. In Africa, China is, for some countries, China is the largest bilateral debtor, but for the whole region, the World Bank actually is. These countries that I have circled here, Congo, Angola, Zambia, and Djibouti, are countries that are highly exposed to Chinese debt, both in terms of commitments and payments. Zambia this morning has gone to the G20 asking for full-on debt restructuring, and it'll be interesting to watch how China reacts to that. We see this as a problem on both sides of the balance sheet. Chinese lending and dollar-denominated lending. I should say that the BRI is a dollar program. All of the overseas investment that China engages with is in US dollars, which is important to be understood. These countries are in a serious crunch right now with all of this, and so is China because it's not getting paid back. All these myths about debt trap diplomacy were debunked before the COVID crisis, but here's the counterfactual right in front of us, that if China really wanted to seize assets of countries around the world, this is when they would be doing it because countries can't pay them back. Actually, what's happening is that China is the most active participant in the two G20 schemes on debt relief in the world economy. Another major risk is environmental risk. We also published something called the China's Global Energy Finance Database, which looks at Chinese finance into the energy sector around the world. If you look in the right-hand column, through 2018, we're going to release, through 2019, we're going to release 2020 data in a month. They've invested about $251.3 billion in the energy sector around the world, 183 of it in BRI countries. If you look at the left-hand column here, that amounts to 59 gigawatts of power plants across the world. The second column is what all 10 multilateral development banks have done for in the public sphere during the same period. That's the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, African Development Bank. They've put up 55 gigawatts in terms of public sector power plants. So just like in terms of the total dollars, like I showed before, China is to be credited for expanding energy access, doubling it in a stepwise manner, 59 gigawatts versus 55. However, we express real concern on the composition of that. If you look at the red, 64% of that is coal-fired power plants. Not only does that contribute to global climate change and local air pollution that impacts public health, it's also a stranded asset now in the world economy. There's only 3 or 4 countries where coal-fired power plants are competitive relative to renewables now. And all these plants that have been built in the past 4 or 5 years will have a 40 or 50 year lifespan. And so within 4 or 5 years, these will not be cost effective. There'll be stranded assets on the balance sheets of host countries, and there'll be stranded assets on the balance sheets of the Chinese development finance agencies that are there. There's 11% in nuclear, 23% in hydroelectric power, but our center's done a lot of work on this hydroelectric power. Unfortunately, a lot of it is in Indonesia and Ecuador in highly biodiverse areas like the Amazon, and is also accentuating social conflicts with indigenous organizations. We estimate that that the overall annual emissions from power generation from Chinese overseas finance is going to be about 571 megatons over its lifetime. Just these overseas plants would put it in the top 20 of total emitters in the world. And that's largely coming because of so many of the coal plants that are in the balance sheet. This is my close to my last slide. We just submitted an article to Nature that examines the extent to which Chinese overseas development finance runs a risk towards highly biodiverse areas and or areas where there are stated indigenous peoples' lands. We were asked to do this by something called the Climate and Land Use Alliance, a consortium of foundations that look at people, livelihoods, and biodiversity across the world. We identify a number of countries. The more purple you get, the more there's a high risk for, on this map, the more there's high risk for both indigenous people and biodiversity. The bluer it is, it's just biodiversity. The redder it is, it's indigenous people. And the punchline is that these projects pose significant risks for biodiversity and indigenous people around the world. China hosts the Conference of the Parties this October for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the global treaty to protect biological diversity around the world. We've been urging the Chinese to incorporate the kinds of performance standards that the International Finance Corporation and the World Bank have in their overseas operations to make sure that indigenous people and biodiversity is taken into account in the siting, planning, and execution of large infrastructure projects. So there's a lot of benefit on the table, but there's a lot of risk on the table. And both China and the host countries have to work hard to maximize those benefits and minimize those risks to make sure that this stepwise increase in finance that, quite frankly, emerging market and developing countries have been begging for 30 years and hadn't been forthcoming from the West is put to good use. On the China side, and I think this reinforces some of the things in Minya's book, they need a coordinating body for the Belt Road Initiative. The Belt Road Initiative has 1,000 different heads. And without coordination, China itself can't get many of the benefits. Most people would say that the port that China built and played a role in Greece was an incredible one. Helped them on a macroeconomic perspective, upgraded the infrastructure to the 21st century, and made a lot of people a lot of money. Because of that, now Chinese firms are all over the Mediterranean building ports, and by definition, there'll be too much competition relative to the amount of ships that are there, and none of them will make money. That's an economic perspective on it, but there's all you can think about that from risk mitigation as well. Their firms don't know the extent to which a country is butting up against its debt sustainability limits, and if a coordinating body isn't signaling that, companies from China will go into countries that might not be able to handle the finance. China in the coordinating body, they need compulsory risk analysis on debt sustainability, social environmental impacts, returns on investments, and the due diligence that institutions like the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation now do. They learn the hard way because they started out the way China is. This needs to be accelerated on the Chinese end. And thirdly, China needs to align the balance sheets with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. We published a paper that shows if they wanted to finance clean energy rather than coal, that countries are asking for about $1 trillion worth of projects, and they're just sitting there ready for finance. Host countries also need to have a China plan. They need upstream planning platforms on what are the strategies for infrastructure in your country, what are the priorities for meeting those plans, and to engage with the Chinese on parts of that plan that can be financed. Host countries also need their own compulsory risk analysis on debt, environment, returns on investment, spillover impacts across the economy, et cetera. And they also need to align these plans to the SDGs in Paris. Last slide here is that China's been making some real steps in this direction over the past 2 years. And I go so far as saying they're basically putting together a BRI 2.0. In November of 2018, the China Development Bank committed to align its balance sheet with the Paris Climate Agreement with a number of other development banks that are part of a consortium it is. They put together their own debt sustainability framework and adopted a set of green investment principles across the BRI. In November 2019, the China Development Bank put together a set of principles to harmonize their overseas operations on debt development and sustainable development goals. And obviously in December 2020 and now in 2021, they're the leading participant in debt relief around the world. This needs to be more institutionalized as part of a centralized coordinating body, but there's steps in the right direction of what our China scholars show, that China is practicing globally what it has done locally, which is crossing the river by touching each stone. They really launched out into the world in their first 5 to 7 years of the Belt Road Initiative. Some things worked really well, some things were a complete disaster. Now they're saying, okay, well, how can we make the BRI not so much about massive amounts of quantity, but how can we focus on quality? I'll stop here during the Q&A. We have a specific proposal about China and engaging in debt for climate swaps, but that's a little off topic today. Thanks so much. You can go to our webpage and take a look at these data sets and download a lot of the papers that came out of today's conversation. Looking forward to talking to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the wide-ranging overview, Kevin. That was really a tour de force of both the economic impacts and also the potential of the complex BRI program. And Bill Grimes will respond to some of the things that you've talked about this morning.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I'm just going to do a little quick housekeeping, which is, Grant, usually the wired headphone works better for a microphone, but if you're having any sound problems, just wave at me and I'll change over to something else. So this is an amazing piece of work that Kevin and his team have put together. Really, the BRI was, everybody knew that it was big, everybody knew that it was important, but facts on the ground were really lacking. And what we've done at, I'm going to say we because I'm also an associate director of one of the programs at GEGI, so we're each other's bosses. Has been to track these things in real time, but in a way that's really conscious and careful, and that builds on a larger body of knowledge that's been developed within the GDP Center and in international cooperation. So really, this is a model of the things that we want to be doing. The only credit that I can take really is that I was involved in hiring Kevin almost 20 years ago. I was on the search committee, which I will continue to remind him probably for the rest of his life. So let me just, I don't want to try to comment too much on the substance, which is a very well delivered and clearly thought out and well documented. So I'm going to make a couple of political points and one economic point. So the first point I want to make, which is going to be super brief, is just to say that that the politics of this are unavoidable. China is going to have to choose sides in ways that it doesn't want to, in countries where it has very, very little knowledge or experience. This is inevitable for this level of engagement. So the choices that are made about where money goes, going to a power plant in Pakistan, for example, or going to roads that move from copper mines in Zambia. Those are things that that require careful political thinking, as well as economic thinking, and they don't have to be different. I mean, to me, 10 years ago, lending an extraordinarily large amount to Venezuelan government seemed like a pretty big risk. Turned out to be a big risk. Okay, that's a place where they kind of look similar. But there are also going to be important political choices, and China's money is going to have important impacts. That is not, I think, of central importance to the research that Kevin has mentioned today, but it will be very important going forward. And that's just a background condition, I think, for anything that involves international relations and such large amounts of resources going across borders. Second, I want to make two institutional political economy points. So first is about path dependence. So one of the things that Kevin and his colleagues are talking about is this problem of funding of coal-fired power plants. There's a bunch of reasons why countries are choosing coal-fired power plants. So within countries, they may have access to coal, they may need a stable base load, they may have greater capability of operating coal, they may not care that much about the climate and pollution implications. And that's, of course, an issue for those countries. But it's also worth noting that, that the decision to export coal-fired power plant technology is not just a host nation decision, but also the sponsoring nation decision. And here I'm just going to note that Japan, which is an extraordinary example of energy conservation and often the development of clean energy, is the second biggest exporter of coal-fired plants around the world. And why? It's because Japanese power plant producers are really good at making coal-fired plants, and they can't sell them in Japan anymore, and they can't sell them in the United States, and they can't sell them in, they can't use these things in many places. And so there's that domestic institutionalized inertia, right, is going to make it very difficult for China not to be exporting coal-fired power plants, particularly if China itself starts really restricting the amount of coal-fired power plants, as they already have started, and the lip service seems to be. So that's a profound institutional political challenge that it makes perfect sense on every level, and yet it's going to be to me that's going to be one of those sort of background conditions that will make it very difficult to achieve what Kevin's talking about. And a second quick point on institutional political economy is Kevin mentioned that this is an opportunity and has been seen as an opportunity to promote industrial restructuring in China, right? So this is the story: China has overcapacity. It's an opportunity to move, to find demand for that capacity, but also an opportunity for upgrading within China. And that, of course, is a really good story. and I think it's largely true. The challenge is that there remain institutional obstacles to industrial restructuring and upgrading in China, largely related to the financing of dirty industries, right? If I can't upgrade my steel plant to be non-polluting, what are my choices, right? So I close it down, or I try to sort of keep surviving. And what we've seen so far in China, again, totally reasonably, is that that when the push to restructuring runs into another concern, slowdown in the economy, for example, political concerns over employment in particular regions, that it's super difficult to for that goal of promoting industrial restructuring to take precedence over keeping people at work. And the decentralized nature of domestic Chinese finance further complicates that because of the way that that you have various bank branches or local development banks that that are essentially not can't be allowed to fail. So again, this is not a critique of China. This is just a fact that it's difficult to do these things, and that in order to get that piece of it, there will need to be a sort of a concerted effort at the political leadership. Now, finally, I want to make an economic point, which Kevin made several times, but I'm going to make it slightly differently. And this is the debt sustainability question, right? And there's been a lot of talk about debt trap, and I don't think China's laying a debt trap. I don't see why that would make sense, right? I don't think China wants to take control of economic resources in Zambia. That sounds like a recipe for just a lot of work and cost and effort. But I am concerned about the intrinsic profitability of the types of projects we're talking about. This is one of the reasons why infrastructure investment is always difficult. How do you get payback on infrastructure? Okay, power plants are relatively easy to say, but there's roads and hospitals and grids and all sorts of stuff where there should be positive. The public good aspect of it is a very important piece, and yet how do I collect the money to pay back on the Chinese side? And so it's not even just profitability of one project. It's as you ramp up across many infrastructure projects, which are super important, that it becomes more and more difficult on the margin to find the resources to pay back, because they're not profitable in the way that that like pulling stuff out of the ground and selling it might be seen as immediately profitable. So there's the old saying, prediction is always difficult, and particularly when it's about the future. And so I'm not going to make predictions about the future, and political scientists are extremely bad at making predictions about the future. But we do know some of the things to look for, and so these are issues that I think are going to be constantly reappearing in the BRI story, and that will interact with that key point that today's presentation about, which is the relationship between infrastructure, debt, and sustainability. And with that, I will stop.
Okay, well, before, Kevin, you respond to Bill's comments, let me just encourage those who are attending to actually type in a question if you have a thought about either Kevin or Bill's comments so far, and we'll get to those after Kevin's response to Bill.
You want me to respond to Bill, or we're going to go?
I think, why don't you go ahead and just respond briefly to Bill, and then we'll take some questions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Bill is saying on this. This is the on the debt sustainability issue. It is the issue of our decade now. Both advanced economies. We because we have our own currencies and can borrow money easily, we've kicked this down the road for a little bit, but we're about to do yet another 2 trillion, which I totally support here in the United States. And the Trump administration did about that much already, about $12 trillion worth of debt in the advanced economies, not including the 2 that's going to go through this week, hopefully. That's a bill that's going to need to be paid, and it's going to put a chill on our ability to mobilize finance for infrastructure and for all the things that we need to be a 21st century world economy. We're still an Eisenhower economy. We've de-invested in infrastructure in the North at a pretty significant clip since the 1960s. In emerging market and developing countries, they're feeling the squeeze right now. China is in the Western press seen as the core to the whole problem. It's 25% of 1/3 of it. And if we're going to get serious about it, the G20 has to focus on the private sector, which is a big component, and the international financial institutions need to play a role as well. That's a little bit trickier because they're the ones that do finance most of this stuff around the world, and they need their preferred creditor status to be able to do that kind of financing. And so if they just start writing off and canceling debt, they're not going to be able to raise the money for the projects of the future. That's why every country in the world, except for the Trump administration in 2020, pushed for a new issuance of the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights. That's essentially like printing money for the rest of the world. That would allow emerging market and developing countries to pay back those international institutions. Then you'd have, since China and most of the Paris Club countries are engaging with debt relief on the bilateral credit level, you'd have the international financial institutions, which are another 1/3 of the problem, being engaged through the SDR allocation. The big nut to crack and a challenge for the Biden administration and for Boris Johnson will be the private sector. To what extent will they play in this game? I encourage people to look at all these studies by the Rhodium Group and the group at SICE. These Washington cooked stories about debt trap diplomacy were proven wrong before COVID. But like I said, this would be the moment where that would happening. Countries, Chad, just in the past 2 weeks, Chad, Zambia, and Angola, countries that have a huge amount of exposure to China, are all on the brink of default. China could be seizing all their assets. Instead, they're the first ones to give them debt relief. This geopolitical thing is not to be ignored by any stretch of the imagination. I know China doesn't like to make analogies to the Marshall Plan, but I think it's important to, because it's one of the only other bilateral-led massive investment projects that we've seen in modern times. And I direct everyone to read a classic 1977 article in the journal International Organization by Charles Meyer. And he talks about what he calls the politics of productivity of the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was seen as a success because it created enough productivity that so many different actors were made better off that everyone liked it. First and foremost was domestic, and this is something that Min Ye talks about in her book, that the Belt Road Initiative is a domestic project. It's that first slide that I show of China's priorities, a lot of that is to address domestic issues. In the United States, the Marshall Plan was key. David Rockefeller was put in charge of an entire commission for how US firms were going to be able to benefit from this in Europe. Obviously, it was named after Marshall, one of the core generals of the war, and he was the person to usher it through Congress on security grounds, that this was going to help stem communism in Europe and help maintain the peace that had just been achieved. And workers in the United States were also for it because they were going to benefit from the exports, and that we had just built a safety net for those that might slip through the cracks, that they would be able to be buoyed. On the European end, it helped bolster the kinds of governments that weren't going to fall to the Soviets. It also had plenty of room for European firms to be able to benefit, and European workers were allowed to organize. They had their own social safety nets, and as long as they weren't linked to the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, they were allowed to flourish, and they benefited from it. That's what Mayer calls the politics of productivity. And that is what China needs to make sure happens. Right now, their domestic actors are doing pretty well. Like Bill said, the coal-fired power plant companies that can't produce at home anymore are benefiting from the BRI. Chinese exports are increasing. They're making a slight impact on increasing the use of the renminbi. So a lot of their objectives have been working up until the COVID crisis with the debt. But on the host countries, it's been a little bit more of a mixed bag. Sometimes the projects don't get through. Big infrastructure projects are always laden with corruption, no matter who's engaged with it. Just ask Halliburton. There's lots of social and environmental struggles around all of these projects. And so the politics of productivity is something that the Chinese need to engage with. Now, that Meyer article talks about how there were 3 things that needed to be examined, that if the US did well and Europe did well, that would help contain the Soviets. Like Bill says, there's a third actor here that we on one level, we can't afford to contain the West. The West and the Chinese need to figure out a way to, on the economic side of all this, to coexist, not to create a Cold War with respect to infrastructure finance.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I'd like to go on to some questions. There have been several that have come in that are quite interesting. And Minya has made a comment that this has been impressive research, but she wonders what domestic groups and policy audience in China are you working with? How can we scholars, academic helps? And I think one of the big contributions of her work is that she really described the fragmented implementation of the BRI within China. And then you made that recommendation to the Chinese, a policy recommendation that they actually establish a coordinating body for the BRI. So perhaps you could comment on Min's question, but let me ask another question from Lyle Goldstein at the Naval War College. He found the outstanding presentation very enlightening. He said certain key countries appear to be antagonistic to the BRI, especially India and Japan. What will be the impact of this problem on Beijing decision-making and its prospects for BRI more generally? Do they present a competitive alternative to the BRI? And I actually would like to piggyback onto that question by saying that you've made a policy recommendation for the Chinese, but what policy recommendations would you have for the current American administration, where much of the Western press and scholarship has been quite skeptical of the BRI? How should the current administration, from an economic point of view the BRI and its challenges? Why don't you take that as a package?
Great questions, Min, Lyle, and Grant. Quickly, Min, we're working with Chinese actors on a number of different fronts. I sit on I'm the co-chair of the Greening the BRI Task Force at the Chinese Ministry of Ecology and Environment. With our collaborators at Peking University and the Institute for World Economics and Politics, we engage a lot with the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China on the China end. But then with our partners in Indonesia, South Asia, the Indian Amazon, and Southern Africa, we work with host country governments to make sure that they also have China plans and are engaging with the Chinese on these different levels. Lyle Goldstein's point and yours too, Grant, is important. Yeah, I would add the Japanese, the Australians, the Indians, and certainly the Americans under the Trump administration have been completely critical of the BRI. In fact, one of the only major pieces of bipartisan legislation under the Trump administration was the passage of the BUILD Act, which created the United States Development Finance Corporation, a $60 billion international development bank, which was largely it was proposed under the Obama administration by people like me, and it was sort of laughed out of the building. But the Trump administration wrapped it as an anti-China US BRI network thing, and it sailed right through Congress. We're glad to have it. Yeah, there's lots of concern, and the concern comes from a multiple of levels, right? And some of it's geopolitical, but alluding to what something that Bill said, and some of it in the Japanese case is because they're losing business. There's like 10 or 12 PhD dissertations going on out there about Chinese and Japanese contests for power plants and hydropower plants in South Asia, and that are really, really fascinating. There's sort of a contest there. Some of these countries are having trouble competing. I've written a couple op-eds and have engaged with the Biden administration on what their strategy should be on this, and it should be one of healthy competition. And the United States has a lot to offer. Unfortunately, the Trump administration on January 4th, just a few days before President Trump left office, and a week before the Ecuadorian president, who has the lowest approval rating in Latin America, cut a deal where the Development Finance Corporation of the United States, this new institution that I talked about, committed a $2.4 billion loan, $3.4 billion loan to Ecuador, on condition that it privatizes state oil and gas concessions to American companies, and that it blocked Chinese technology from the country into perpetuity. That's not the way to compete, to make countries make that kind of a choice. Jorge Heine at the Pardee School and myself wrote an op-ed about that, and we're happy to hear that the Biden administration is going to tear that deal up. The United States, through our own institutions like the Development Finance Corporation, and because of our exorbitant privilege at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, we can offer healthy competition that can not only provide these services around the world, but also help improve the Chinese version of it as well. The United States' finance is cheaper. There's a lot of talk out there that these loans from China are sweetheart deals. It's not true at all. They're somewhere between 6 and 9% for host countries. That's pretty expensive in a world that's had quantitative easing and free money around the world. The U.S. and the World Bank can offer 1 to 3% on this financing. So number one, it can be cheaper, and number two, we have to prove that it can be more high quality. If we're investing in wind power conversion into solar power plants, and we're incorporating due diligence on return and investment, on competitive bidding, and also on social and environmental engagement, we can show a better way. And I'm happy to see that the Biden administration executive order says just that. Last Tuesday's executive order on climate change says that the United States, through the World Bank, the IMF, and the Development Finance Corporation, is going to make sure that our finance is not making countries privatize their state-owned assets for more fossil fuel companies in the United States, but rather that it's actually going to have to be aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement. So I see some good things there. That's important. One, because we can get in the game. The US and the Western-backed development finance institutions have abandoned infrastructure in the 1970s. And the big influx of China in this space has helped move those institutions into that space. We can be cheaper, we can be greener, we can be more inclusive, and China will therefore have the incentive to do the same thing. We've seen that already. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is headed by China, is probably the cleanest and most effective infrastructure financier in Asia right now. They got to start with a clean slate. There was so much pressure on them and such a spotlight on them that they ended up really starting off on a good foot. We need to really lead by example, and we'll see more Asian infrastructure investment banks and less China Development Bank kind of activity. But the US has a long way to go. The European Investment Bank is really the global model.
So I have a quick note to add. There's a lot of discussion about U.S.-China global rivalry and such driving these things, and it's not unimportant, but I think underlying what Kevin is saying, and I completely agree with that, is that if you just look at this top-down sort of structural realist, that's a contest thing, you miss 90% of what's going on. The only way to understand this is to understand ground up, to understand what are the actual impacts of the infrastructural development, what are the actual impacts of the debt sustainability, where are the actual levels of competition over particular projects and approaches, and the sort of China bad, US good, need to fight back impulse that you see in a lot of American discourse, such as it um, is not helpful. And I think it reflects a lack of understanding of development and development economics that can be quite misleading. I mean, if we did the same thing in talking about nuclear rivalry without understanding how nuclear weapons and strategy work, anybody would say that was a really dumb way of approaching it. So we need to do it holistically. The top-down perspective is maybe important, but you just are you missing everything if you're not doing the bottom-up work that Kevin and his team have been doing.
Thanks, Bill. Kevin, I'll just take two questions from the chat, and we'll have to wrap up quickly. We're coming towards the end of our hour, but these are both related to host country questions. And one is just a comment which you started to make in your last remarks about what are alternatives for financing for host countries between the Chinese options and other options. And the second question is, should host countries consider any kind of collective approach to dealing with China, and how might that work out?
Yeah, I really think it would be highly beneficial for countries to collectively engage with China on some of this financing. The region of the world that I know the best, but it's similar to the African continent because of the legacy of colonialism and the geographic nature of where mountains and forests are. Infrastructure gaps are so huge there, and most infrastructure starts up in extractive areas and goes out to the ports. And there isn't interconnectivity among those two continents, South America and the African continent. And all of those countries would benefit by trading with each other and having interconnectivity with each other. And so a collective engagement with China on issues like that would be, and with the West would really be incredibly beneficial. Both regions have created forums for that. On the Africa end, it's called FOCAC, and on the Latin American, it's something called CELAC, and the finance ministers do meet as a collective with China, which is interesting. You don't see that in the West. All African finance ministers meeting with their Chinese counterparts a couple times a year. And they do have lots of discussions. But it hasn't resulted in many multi-country deals. And that's unfortunately because a lot of the political economy in the countries, they're competing against each other for the Chinese finance, and they don't see that the long intermediate benefit of working together might outweigh any national level benefits of just trying to get a quick deal now. But again, that's partly because everybody's pinched right now, especially in Africa and South America. These countries are experiencing incredible debt distress. And so whatever you can get right now to get you out of this is something that you're going to go for, which is dangerous. And that's the other thing the U.S. can do, is return to the multilateral system. We abandoned it for the past 4 years, and almost made 2020, we made the kind of mistakes that Great Britain made in 1933 by obstructing the ability of public goods to be prevented. We made this crisis a lot worse. Biden administration needs to work with the Italians through the G20 to make sure that the world doesn't fall off a cliff like we did in the Great Depression.
Okay, we've run out of time, and there is a question or two that we won't be able to get to. My apologies for that. This series is one of many conversations that are taking place nationally and internationally about the BRI. For access to publications related to this talk and to current GDP Center research, Google BD BU GDP Center and click the Publications tab to review and access the many related articles to our subject. You can follow Kevin's Global China Colloquium on Wednesday mornings by Googling GDP Center at BU. Before we close, note that Harvard East Asian professor Ezra Vogel passed away on December 20th, 2020. As you know, he was one of the leading lights in both Japanese and Chinese studies, both nationally and internationally. Ezra's great biography of Deng Xiaoping remains an indispensable backdrop to this series on the BRI and to so many other subjects. Ezra provided a model for all of us working to understand the world and change it for the better. May his memory be a blessing. In closing, let me say thank you to all of you who have joined us for this virtual event. Special thanks to Kevin Gallagher for his perceptive remarks about the economic risks and benefits of the BRI. Many thanks also to our discussant, Bill Grimes, for his insightful observations. Our appreciation goes to the Global Development Policy Center for sponsoring this event and to Xinyu Ma for recording the proceedings. The video recording will be posted on the website of the Pardee School of Global Studies on the webpage with the series label, Assessing China's Belt and Road Initiative. I encourage you to check the websites of the various Pardee School centers for events that might be particularly tailored to your interests. For instance, the Center for the Study of Asia at 4 p.m. this afternoon is hosting BU PhD Kaoru Ueda, who will present on the Japanese Diaspora Initiative in the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Regarding this current BRI series, we look forward to having you join us again in 2 weeks on February 19th for Minye's presentation, U.S.-China Strategic Competition and the BRI. Joshua Schifrinson will provide discussant remarks. I'm Grant Rode from the Pardee School at BU, wishing that you all stay safe and well. Many thanks to all of you for joining us today.